As the days of summer pass by into autumn, the nights begin to grow longer, colder, and the promise of the first snowfall lingers in the crisp evening air. Colors of warmth replace the green grass and flowers as we mourn the descent of the sun and welcome the cool contrast of the moon. Miniature candies start popping up on store shelves. Spirit Halloween dawns with the promise of another aesthetic haul. And we find ourselves drawn toward watching horror movies, the vibe of the season tempting us to experience some chills and thrills. But some of us want more. We want to know the things that perhaps we shouldn't. With an increasing preoccupation into the occult, the unknown, and ultimately death, people today tend to flock toward those who claim to be able to provide answers from the other side. And it's at this time of year that these professions are enjoying some of their most profitable months. The psychic services industry pulls in over $2 billion annually, seeking to guide those searching for answers. Whether it's wanting to know your life purpose, or to communicate with your dearly departed relative, or whatever the case may be, there is a tarot reader, a clairvoyant, a medium, a psychic, an astrologer, whomever, offering readings on TikTok, on Etsy, or even at your local metaphysical shop. And whilst this can seem quite innocuous, I mean, who cares if you're getting a $20 tarot reading? Many people turn a skeptical eye to these services, calling out the psychics as frauds or fakes, believing that these are people who are employing tactics to exploit others in their most vulnerable moments. Others claim that there's even a psychological component, pointing to the power of suggestion or raising questions about free will in these circumstances. What's wild, though, is that Psychic Jane, or whomever you see whilst you scroll through your Instagram reels, is not a new phenomenon. Some of us might remember the Disney show That's So Raven, or even those psychic hotlines that you could call into in the 90s.
Who asked you to go out of town? The stupid young one or the married one?
The married one.
That's what I thought. Don't go, you hear me? And you know what? You're not listening to me because I see you going. I see you going. I'm just telling you, I'm trying to help you to avoid the heartache. Don't go blindly through life. Let me use the power of the tarot to show you the way. Call me now for your free reading.
But even these aren't the first instances of psychics being made available to the public for entertainment. These types of practices, intertwining belief, entertainment, social commentary, etc., have existed for a super long time, with the emergence of seances rising to extreme popularity in the early 1900s. The allure of mystery and the unknown became a cultural spectacle. So, are these so-called spiritualists providing us with valuable insight, or even just comfort at the very least? Is it simply just entertainment, or is there a more sinister ploy at play here? Derived from the French word for session, a séance originally referred to a gathering, but its English usage developed a paranormal connotation. A typical séance involved a small group of participants attempting to communicate with spirits through mediums believed to be acting as conduits to the afterlife. Communication was thought to occur through disembodied voices, moving objects, music of an unknown source filling the room, or ghostly apparitions. Early sessions often took place in dimly lit rooms with tools like Ouija boards, spirit trumpets, and automatic writing aiding the process. Automatic writing in particular let women publish entire books, claim divine knowledge, and gain literary recognition without having to go through male-dominated institutions. These spirit-authored texts covered everything from theology to social commentary. In this way, women were able to obtain and produce knowledge during a time where that often wasn't the norm. The rise of spiritualism was rampant in the 1800s. The Victorian era provided a great landscape for seances due to high mortality rates and rapid societal changes. World War I claimed the loss of many lives, and some people really wanted to know why their loved one didn't come home. Life expectancy in general wasn't very long, so for those who had lost children, it was a way to provide some comfort that their loved one was okay in the afterlife. It was referred to as the ghost fever of the 1800s because experiencing the paranormal became a daily possibility. Many sought solace in the possibility of contacting deceased loved ones. They wanted that affirmation and connection. The spiritualism movement ran on the belief that a person's soul, or at least their consciousness, continues on after death and can be contacted by the living, as the afterlife was seen as more of a dynamic place where spirits could interact with the living and essentially give people advice, kind of like becoming spirit guides. Advances in science, such as the discovery of electricity and magnetism, let people feel the vibe a bit more with the possibility of spiritual claims actually being true. Seances were run by someone who was seen as being the conduit for being able to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Over time, the practice evolved, shifting from parlor gatherings to stage performances to even religious services in spiritualist churches. In the UK, seances were more so seen as being for the upper class. However, in America, it was more common amongst everyday people, which allowed the working class to be able to access comfort and meaning in the spiritual world and not just the rich. Emanuel Swedenborg is thought to be the father of spiritualism and said he was called on by God to reform Christianity and create a new church, by which he wrote a book about the afterlife in 1758 called Heaven and Hell. In this book, he described how the spirit world worked, and in his depiction, there was no black and white separation of heaven and hell as it's typically been portrayed in Christianity, but rather a series of higher and lower heavens and hells, and that humans, once they die, have free will and reason. So the way that I understand this, basically meaning that if your soul is kind of like, hey, I'm a toxic bitch through and through, you'll kind of be walking yourself down to hell as opposed to somebody automatically placing you there. Like your vibe is just calling you there. Though when you first die, you apparently go into this kind of limbo where you just kind of meet your ghost self and go head out on your soul's final destination. So Swedenborg's writings were seen as being quite a big influence to the rise of spiritualism. Early seances were performed in candlelit rooms, people sitting around a table holding hands and asking spirits to make noises within the room. But then as time went on, tools started to become introduced, so the mediums performing these seances started to up their game to provide more evidence of the afterlife. This was accomplished through people offering specific types of seances, bringing in people who may have aligned with a more particular practice. So there were religious seances in a church, and this was seen as more of a healing service with a focus on receiving messages from loved ones in a more positive manner. There were stage seances, evolving into the mediumship style that we often see today, where the medium would contact spirits on a stage before an audience. And then there were also people who were just doing it for fun or on their own or with groups of friends, mainly just young people who were interested in learning more about this side of the paranormal. Just mainly young people trying to understand the line between reality and the paranormal. And people could utilize a variety of methods to communicate with the other side, including mediumship, which we just mentioned, so receiving messages from spirits and relaying them. There was channeling, which is basically allowing the ghost to possess you for a bit. There's being in a trance and either writing stuff down, like automatic writing, or having someone else write things down. There's using a Ouija board, which in 1967 became the first game to outsell Monopoly. Other people use things like trumpets, which were said to be able to magnify the whispers of spirits, slates, which were two chalkboards bound together and when opened would reveal messages written by ghosts, tables that were said to rotate or levitate when spirits were around, and cabinets, which were portable closets into which mediums were placed, usually bound, so that they would not be able to directly manipulate the attendees during the seance, said to provide more plausibility to the evidence at a seance. The Ouija board aspect of everything is really interesting given that automatic writing was so popular at the time, but automatic writing was really more of a solitary activity and people wanted something that was more collaborative, more interactive, which led to the planchette. Now, we all know the famous iconography of the Ouija board with that heart-shaped object that everyone puts their fingers on and it moves around the board to spell out words. I even have a tattoo of one. It's hard to turn my arm like this, but you can kind of see it. But the first ones that were used were heart-shaped pieces of wood where a pencil could be mounted on it, and during a seance, the group members would all place their fingers on the planchette, and it would supposedly draw or write things out with the collective consciousness or from a ghost. Seances often reflected the gender norms of the day whilst simultaneously challenging them. Women were predominant as mediums. Their perceived intuition and passiveness deemed essential for accessing the spirit world. Men, of course, were considered to be way less likely to let a spirit overtake their body, and the women were just so much more susceptible to that. In the 1800s, early 1900s, women were largely barred from religious authority, public speaking, or even publishing. But mediumship gave them that socially acceptable in. Since they were seen as being a vessel for the spirit, typically male spirits, it let them teach and lead discussions in public about things like science and morality. Because if it's technically a man's words, it could be more widely accepted by the general public coming from a woman's mouth. It became a spiritualized form of public discourse that men couldn't easily shut down without insulting religious belief. This dynamic offered women a rare avenue for authority, autonomy, and financial independence. Since spiritualism was rejecting those cultural norms that were deemed as exclusionary, it made itself a little pocket for affirming things seen outside the cultural norms at the time, such as gender fluidity. Mediums like Jessie Shepard, who channeled spirits of various genders, such as singing in a high soprano voice, claiming that this was from the female spirits flowing through their throat. There were movements advocating dress reform, where different genders would wear other genders' clothing, and all of this demonstrated spiritualism's progressive stance on identity and self-expression. According to Victorian literature and culture, quote, the medium or the performing spirit could shake off their own personality and take on others at will. In doing so, offer the possibility of reconceptualizing identity. In the academic essay Queering the Séance, it said that the term queer during the Victorian era was taken more to mean something that was outside of the norm, but by the end of the century, it was becoming more of an encompassing term of non-heterosexuality. Leaders like Victoria Woodhull were heavily involved in spiritualism. Many suffragettes saw it as a divine endorsement of women's authority. They believed spirits wanted women to speak out. So spiritualism provided a theological argument for feminism. If spirits spoke through women, clearly, women deserved a voice in society. In 1857, Andrew Jackson Davis, who was described as being the John the Baptist of the spiritualist movement, which I had to look up what John the Baptist was because I was not raised religious. Like, I'm quite agnostic, but I do practice witchcraft, so I'm very sorry about my lack of knowledge on Christianity. But from my understanding, I guess he was like around before Jesus and told people about him and that he was coming and told people to repent. So Andrew Jackson Davis was said to have introduced a lot of the core principles of spiritualism, communicating with spirits and the concept of the afterlife, and at one point described proper seating arrangements at a seance, saying that men and women should be seated alternately around the table to form a kind of magnetic battery, which would then create a more effective environment for spiritual communication. But instead of referring to gender as your assigned sex at birth, proper seating arrangements of alternating feminine and masculine energies were determined by metaphysical principles, attributes of character, and intellectual temperament. Which is all just super cool that there was something so popular back then that was challenging these authoritarian and patriarchal norms and providing a space for unconventional ideas. Mediumship honestly became a legitimate career path for many women, one of the few professions where they could earn money outside of a marriage or domestic work. And like I said earlier, this was giving women access to financial independence, but it was also giving them access to fame. Spiritualism opened doors for women that was seen as being completely radical for that time period. Mediumship gave women this kind of loophole for power, and this was really rare given that they were living in an area where public speaking, leadership was largely off limits to them, so by speaking as a conduit for spirits was the perfect workaround. They'd say that because the spirit was speaking through them, it wasn't them who was lecturing, preaching, guiding people through grief, helping to create spiritual communities. It was the spirit, and like I said, through this, men couldn't really object or they'd be sounding very sacrilegious. And these ladies were taking their chance to go all out for these events. Theatrics became part of the spiritualist brand, and many mediums leaned into the visual spectacle of transforming their seances into fully immersive performances. Some, like Eva Carrière and Juliette Bisson, weaponized sensuality as part of their mystique. We will come back to them, but their rumored romances and sexy seances were really just marketing ploys to toy with the male gaze, as these shows were attended by overwhelmingly male audiences, and these girls had them hooked. Though it is important to maintain that there were still many instances of these spaces being influenced by the ideals of the time, which were largely patriarchal in nature. And I mean, were some of them faking it? Absolutely. But they were also redefining power, gender, and art in the process. These seance girls were building an empire, and we love that for them. Arthur Ford was one of the most infamous and controversial spiritualist mediums of the 20th century. He founded the Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship in 1955, but his rise to fame began decades earlier. In the 1920s, Ford toured the US claiming to channel a spirit guide named Fletcher, eventually settling in New York City as the pastor of a spiritualist church. He quickly gained a devoted following, and in 1927 even traveled to England, where none other than Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, an outspoken believer in spiritualism, attended one of Ford's lectures and called it one of the most astonishing things he'd ever seen. But Ford's most notorious moment came through his connection to Harry Houdini. After Houdini's death on Halloween in 1926, his widow Bess began attending seances in a desperate attempt to contact him. Arthur Ford entered the picture shortly after, and in 1928, he claimed that through his spirit guide Fletcher, he had contacted Houdini's mother, who delivered a powerful word, forgive. This word held deep meaning for Houdini, as it was believed to reference a bitter family falling out involving his brother Leopold. Ford insisted that no one could have known this word except for Bess, who confirmed it was the word Houdini longed to hear from his mother. She even wrote to Ford saying that the message would have changed Houdini's life had it come during his lifetime. The press, however, was skeptical, and it turned out that nearly a year earlier, Bess had publicly stated that any genuine message from Houdini would include the word forgive, so that secret was already out. But Ford didn't stop there. In January 1929, he visited Bess, who was reportedly bedridden after a fall and in a delirious state. Ford claimed to have received a new coded message from Houdini's spirit. During a seance held on January 8th, Ford went into a trance and, speaking in what he claimed was Houdini's voice, recited a series of words: Rosabelle, answer, tell, pray, answer, look, tell, answer, tell. The key phrase, Rosabelle, was a reference to a song Bess used to sing to Houdini. Those words were supposedly translated using some sort of secret code the couple used in their old stage telepathy act, which revealed the word believe. But the code itself wasn't actually a secret, as it had been published in Houdini's official biography, and it had been printed in newspapers years earlier. Still, Ford's team asked Bess to issue a statement confirming that the message was authentic. Later, a newspaper claimed that the entire seance was a publicity stunt, part of a plan for a lecture tour featuring Ford and Bess. Bess fired back in a public letter denying it, and eventually even sued Ford for using her statements in his advertisement. After a while, Bess publicly renounced spiritualism, stating that no medium had ever truly presented the clue she was waiting for, and that for years, spiritualists had actually exploited her grief to make her believe Houdini was reaching out from the other side. And something you may not know, which I certainly didn't know prior to researching for this video, was that Harry Houdini, the famous magician, actually devoted a ton of time to proving that spiritualists and psychics and mediums were fake. But even before he became a relentless skeptic, Harry Houdini had wanted so bad to believe in the afterlife. When his mother passed away, Harry Houdini was devastated. Grief-stricken and desperate, he and his wife Bess began attending seances, even hosting some of their own in hopes of finding a true gifted medium who could help them connect with his mom. But after years of witnessing trickery, cold reading, and sleight of hand masquerading as spirit contact, because Houdini was a magician, he knew what things to look for and could spot that deception. Houdini became convinced that these so-called psychics were nothing more than con artists preying on the vulnerability of the bereaved. And this launched a turning point in Harry Houdini's life. He launched a personal crusade to expose fraudulent mediums, turning his skills as a master illusionist into tools for debunking the tricks of the spiritualist trade. And one of the most famous confrontations came in the early 1920s with a woman named Mina Crandon, better known as Marjorie. Marjorie was a glamorous and mysterious medium from Boston who claimed she could channel her dead brother Walter from beyond the grave. Her seances were infamous, not just for the messages she claimed to deliver, but for their shock factor. She often performed these seances completely naked, claiming it prevented accusations of hiding tools or props. At one point, Scientific American offered a $2,500 prize to any medium who could demonstrate genuine psychic ability under scientific scrutiny, and Marjorie quickly stepped up to prove herself. A panel of judges was assembled that included authors, researchers, scientists, and Harry Houdini. And from the beginning, Houdini was skeptical. Marjorie was being sus in his mind, which led to rumors beginning to circulate that he was planting evidence or using hidden tricks to discredit her. I'm presuming he didn't actually do that, but due to all of these rumors, the tension between these two people grew, and Marjorie's supporters began calling Houdini biased and unfair, whilst Houdini was adamant that he had uncovered signs of fraud, including apparently a false thumb that he thought she was using to manipulate objects during the seance. Though no one ever conclusively proved that Marjorie was a fraud, the prize was never awarded, and Harry Houdini's reputation as a medium slayer only grew. Now, for our next controversial spotlight. Maggie and Kate Fox were 14 and 11 respectively, and these girls lived with their family in Hydesville, New York, and they were sure that their house was haunted. Confiding in a neighbor, they said that every night they would hear what sounded like raps on the walls and furniture, with Kate eventually realizing that she could communicate with the spirit, requesting a certain number of raps in return for an answer. The source of the sound was thought to be the spirit of a peddler who had been murdered at the farmhouse 5 years prior. People began coming to the Fox house to witness this phenomenon, and soon enough, the girls were locally famous. Their older sister Leah was also soon known to be able to communicate with the dead. Capitalizing on their newfound fame, the three sisters set off on a professional tour, conducting seances in hotel parlors at various times throughout the day. Admission for the Fox Sisters seance was $1, equal to around $40 today. But with all of this popularity, also came a ton of skepticism. The girls were accused of a variety of ways that they were faking their performances, but no evidence of fraud was ever found. So the sisters kept doing what they were doing, and after a while, as the spiritualism movement grew rapidly, more and more techniques were being introduced, thus dimming the spotlight on the Fox sisters and their ghostly rapping. The girls eventually got married and moved on with their life, but in 1888, 40 years after the initial rise to popularity, Maggie Fox gave an interview where she said she and her sisters had made the whole thing up. But none of it was ever real. The girls were making those noises by dropping apples or cracking their knuckles to make the rapping sounds, further stating that their older sister Leah knew that they were faking and had exploited her younger sisters anyway. But then a year later, she recanted this statement and then died like a few years after that, so who knows? But other notable figures during this time were mediums like Cora Scott Hatch, who began her career as a teenage trance lecturer, meaning she was paraded around the country as a teenager by her parents and could speak with what was described as a supernatural eloquence on any topic given by the audience. Edgar Cayce, known for his prophetic readings, became prominent despite skepticism. He claimed to be able to answer questions about topics such as reincarnation, Atlantis, future events, where he would go into a sleep state, give the reading, and once out of the trance was apparently unable to remember anything he'd said. Edgar Cayce, his wife and his secretary were said to guide the readings and would caution clients that his readings should be taken into account only if they were going to lead to a better life for the person, and to test what he was saying, not just accept the reading on blind faith. Even people like Mary Todd Lincoln brought attention to seances. She was the wife of Abraham Lincoln, who was a president in the US. And Mary had lost her young son to typhoid. So in grieving his death, she started hosting seances at the White House, hoping to connect with him. So seances were becoming quite the popular Friday night activity of the time, but hand in hand with this came much more scrutiny to the spiritualism practices, aka debunkers. Some people were just not down with what seances were trying to accomplish. And thus, we have people like Harry Houdini, magician extraordinaire, devoting their time to exposing fraudulent practices within spiritualism, including fake mediums, fake seances, fake practices, just all of the little bits of fakery that could have been going on during that time, and trying to give rational explanations for what could actually be happening. I don't know if you've ever seen those clips on YouTube from that guy named James Randi, who had a whole show dedicated to putting spiritualists on blast and offering them money if they could legitimately perform a mystical task without being proven otherwise.
James, you are prepared to pay him $10,000 if he can turn the page of the telephone directory with certain controls.
That's right.
You have the $10,000, do you, Randy?
I do indeed. Now what I have here is particles of a white plastic, which when given a good puff, good heavy puff of air, will, I think, rather conclusively show whether or not blowing is a method accomplished. But it certainly should be very interesting indeed to see what now occurs.
James?
Ready? The styrofoam and the lights form electricity which pulls the page. Look. It pulls the page down instead of freeing the pages. Something that is going to keep, that isn't going to form like static electricity.
You mean put something else, some other material around here?
Something that is not foam. Foam causes static electricity, and the light is what heats it up.
I've heard the question, but the question is not valid because it's making an assumption which is not true. The foam does not in any way create static electricity, and Mr. Hydrake, in demonstrating that the pages were clinging together, didn't demonstrate it to my satisfaction. I think we could perhaps ask the judges for their opinion on that. I am not a scientist, so I'm not qualified to declare on it.
Judges?
Whatever static electricity exists in the styrofoam would not really affect the movement of the page or the clinging of the pages together. in my opinion.
I would add that if this is in fact psychic functioning, I don't really see why that would make a difference.
The static is going to still be here because of the foam. See, that's what
Well,
I'm
it is
saying.
the opinion of the judges that there is not enough static formed by the foam to be a problem. So, under the conditions agreed upon, it would seem that now you should at least try with psychic power to turn the page of the telephone directory, James.
Okay.
It's not going to turn for you?
No, it isn't. This isn't a magician's trick. I can't just come up, bang, bang, and it's over. I have to be to where I can work with something small and then big, to build up my own self. So this
Well,
is, it isn't a trick. It has to be done, this is just, it's power. It's mental power.
The conditions agreed upon have been fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
Bob, the comment very briefly is that I have gone through many hundreds of these tests with many hundreds of people who claim to have psychic powers. And quite frankly, it's more or less the same story every time. When a simple, direct, very uncomplicated protocol is used and the control is applied, the psychic forces don't seem to be present, if indeed they are ever present at all.
I think he's rad. He's from Toronto and learned magic whilst in a body cast for 13 months from a bicycle accident, and I guess he literally dropped out of school to join the circus and perform magic tricks. And apparently at one point he went to a church, saw a pastor claiming to read minds, and so he interrupted the show and told everybody how the tricks were done. And the police were apparently called, and so James Randi spent 4 hours in jail, and then he was just like, okay, yeah, this is gonna be my new career now, exposing these fake bitches. I sometimes watch compilations of his show on YouTube, and it's so good. I love it. Psychological studies have explored the mechanisms underneath the belief of seances. So the power of suggestion, demand characteristics, the ideomotor effect, where participants subconsciously move objects like planchettes, are well documented. Experiments have demonstrated how verbal cues and environmental contexts can create convincing yet illusory experiences of the paranormal. Such findings suggest that the appeal of seances lies not in empirical evidence, but in the human desire for connection and meaning. In addition to my college degree of media production, I also have a university degree in sociology and psychology, so this is my time to shine. So the ideomotor effect is a subconscious mechanism in which a Ouija board user's mind unknowingly guides their hand that rests on the planchette. So they literally believe that they're not moving it, but they are, because these are involuntary muscle movements that are triggered by your subconscious. Some say that with this explanation, any words or phrases that come from the Ouija board are things that your subconscious mind already knows or believes to be true, which I think is fair because this idea is similar to that of tarot, where some people believe that the cards you pull, the interpretations you get, are more so just providing clarity rather than future prediction, because your subconscious mind already knows what's going on, already knows what it is that you want, the manifesting that your mind wants. So pulling tarot cards is more of a visual representation of your subconscious mind. And as humans, we are very easily influenced, very susceptible to suggestion, very prone to agree with what the people in the room think, or really just what the loudest person in the room thinks. In the 90s in England, an experiment was conducted by psychologists to try to prove this phenomenon was prevalent within seances, and this involved hiring an actor to play the role of a medium who would be leading the session. 25 people were asked to fill out a questionnaire about their paranormal beliefs, and there was a pretty even divide between those who believed in the supernatural, those who did not, and those who were skeptical or just unsure. So then they were brought to the seance, and the participants had been told that the goal of this session was to see if they as a collective could cause objects to move with their minds. So they all all joined hands, and the medium, aka the actor, who, funnily enough, said that he did not possess any powers himself and was just there to guide them through the session, asked everyone to turn their attention to a ball on the table. He asked them to focus on this ball with all of their might and see if they had telekinetic powers as a group. And well, wouldn't you know it, the ball rose 18 inches into the air and then fell to the ground. And the dude leading the session is like, oh my god, that is so cool. You guys should try to lift the table next. And so the group did, focusing all their attention on levitating the table to where the actor, being an actor, was like, oh my god, you guys are totally levitating this table. And if you haven't already guessed, the table did not actually move at all. And the ball had actually been attached to a stick that was being moved by a hidden assistant. And the actor kept insisting that the group had moved the table. So after the session was done and the participants were interviewed, it turned out that 31% believed that the table had actually moved. And the group who were in the category of being believers prior to the experiment starting were the highest, suggesting that the suggestions of the actor played a significant role in the experiences of the participants, supporting the idea that verbal suggestion could potentially be used to deceive people during a seance and make people believe that something supernatural was happening when it really wasn't. In another experiment, also in the 90s, researchers James Horan and Rents Lang conducted a fascinating experiment inside a dimly lit performance theater. The space had 5 distinct areas, and 22 participants were asked to visit each of these areas alone and take note of what they saw, heard, and felt. But half of them were told that the building was haunted, while the other half were simply told it was under renovation. Afterward, all of the participants filled out a detailed questionnaire measuring both psychological and physical sensations, such as changes in mood, temperature perception, feelings of being watched, or anxiety. The results were wild. The group who believed they were in a haunted location reported significantly more intense and eerie experiences on 9 out of 10 measurements. This suggested that the power of suggestion alone, just being told a place is haunted, can influence how we perceive our surroundings, making ordinary spaces feel supernatural. And it's a perfect example of how belief and expectation can shape our reality. And with these beliefs, even these fake experiences can cause people to believe so heartily in them that it reinforces the idea that the spiritualist community is correct and that the scientific community is wrong. So at what point does it go past harmless belief and into delusion? Being a medium or a spiritualist or a channeler or whatever descriptor you want to apply, to me, honestly, is so similar to being a stage magician, especially when you think about the practices that have been deemed as being fraudulent. In the late 1800s, a mail order catalog was published where people could order rigged seance equipment to help them put on a convincing show, such as fake hands, instructions on how to make a table tilt, and recordings of mysterious sounds. Where utilizing these methods along with a dark room could really help pull off the vibe of these theatrics and sleight of hand. Photographic evidence was also exposed as being fake, as photography in the 1800s was still very new. So if a photo was taken during a seance, there have been reports of images being superimposed upon each other, so it would appear as though a translucent figure was hovering over the table, which back then, and with not much frame of reference, could appear incredibly convincing to people. Mediums themselves would try a variety of tactics to prove they were legitimate, such as binding themselves in ropes and being locked in a cabinet, where magicians would then go and try these methods on their own and were successful, proving that these were simply other forms of trickery. Other mediums would try to pass what were known as fire tests, where they would hold hot coals or pass their hands through fire, which ended up being that they were wearing fireproof material, which apparently was made out of camphor gum, Scotch whiskey, quicksilver, or liquid storax. And then there is the infamous ghostly byproduct known as ectoplasm. Many of us know this substance as being some sort of gelatinous material, but it was actually made up of something else during the 1800s. During seances, some mediums were known to essentially birth ectoplasm from their bodies, which they would call ectoplasm, but it was not a jelly-like substance. This ectoplasm was fabric-like in nature, and the medium would spew it out from their mouth, their sleeves, out of their biological hidey hole, making it look very dramatic and physical. There are photos from that time that are just absurd, and so many of them look like they have faces in them. And I don't blame people for thinking that these were real at the time. Like, if I saw one of those back then, I would be like, what the fuck is this? The ruse for this was that mediums would often try to prevent audience members or participants from touching the so-called ectoplasm by saying it would kill the medium if they did. Otherwise, they would be holding these seances in the dark, saying that the light would make the ectoplasm disappear, making it easier to get away with saying this ectoplasm was legit. But in reality, the fabricy ectoplasm these spiritualists were using was nothing more than cheesecloth, gauze, rags, things that they could easily shove up and spit out. But as this looked pretty jarring on film, eventually enough people didn't believe it anymore, and that method fell out of favor with spiritualists. Though the slimy green ectoplasm that most of us know, just for funsies, if you were curious, is just a pop culture thing. Movies like Ghostbusters really popularized it, and it looked a lot cooler and spookier, being this glowing blob of goo as opposed to like thrown up cheesecloth. One of the most notorious ectoplasm mediums of the early 20th century was Martha Barreau, who was gaining quite a bit of notoriety within the spiritualist community and the gossip columns of the time. Barreau had become famous, and make no mistake, this was a business. Mediumship was one of the few lucrative careers available to women at the time, as we've gone over, giving them income, influence, and a whole lot of attention. And Barreau used this to her advantage by producing long, gauzy strips of ectoplasm during her sessions, often with ghostly faces appearing in the floating fabric. But those spirit faces were cut out of newspapers. And not just the photo of your average Joe, she was cutting out pictures of like famous celebrities and politicians. And you know, people aren't stupid, so eventually they realized that these were famous faces that they recognized. And eventually Barreau was exposed, her reputation was tarnished, but she did not slink into the shadows. She came back in full force under a new name, Eva Carrière, which we talked about earlier. And she teamed up with another medium named Juliette Bisson, and these gals began hosting seances fit for late night entertainment. They were still vibing with the ectoplasm, but this time in their sensual seances, they were setting the mood with ectoplasm appearing from some rather scandalous places. The whispered rumor of the women being lovers really played into the spectacle and captivated male audiences who were very eager to believe in the spell of Eva and Juliette. And they weren't the only ones. Many mediums of the time leaned into that performative and sometimes erotic nature of spiritualism to mesmerize their audiences. And mediums leaned into this aesthetic not just to sell the illusion, but to command attention. I was initially drawn to doing a video on this concept when I rewatched the movie Ouija: Origin of Evil from 2016, which is the sequel to Ouija from 2014, which I have not seen, but apparently it sucks. But the sequel, Origin of Evil, was written, directed, and edited by Mike Flanagan, who did the Haunting of Hill House series. Which, honestly, side note, I have not seen a lot of Mike Flanagan movies or shows. I've only seen The Midnight Club, which, if you have health anxiety, do not watch this. And The Fall of the House of Usher, which I really enjoyed. But I've never seen Haunting of Hill House or Bly Manor or Midnight Mass or whatever. I feel like I really should. But Origin of Evil, this film is about a woman who is living in LA in the 60s, and she's working out of her house as a medium. But, spoiler alert, she is a fake medium doing the whole seance trickery bit, and she employs a number of methods to execute a show for her clients, a fake show. So she utilizes hidden mechanisms like magnets and strings to move the planchette on the table. There are hidden speakers she's using to project disembodied voices during the seances, leading clients to believe that these are the voices of spirits. Her 2 daughters sneakily assist in her routine, moving objects or making noises to further add to the illusion. And she does cold reading, which is where mediums pay attention to the emotional states of their clients and are able to gather personal information to make the messages, supposedly from spirit, seem more authentic and tailored to the client. So for this, mediums can look at a person and make generalizations about them based on their clothing, age, gender, their demeanor, which gives clues about a person's lifestyle, their job, their personality, and body language plays a big role in this, as well as how someone's sitting, their facial expression can show whether or not you are agreeing with somebody, so that person can therefore modify their method further based on that. And then there's a technique called Barnum statements, which are vague statements that can apply to basically anyone, but also at the same time feel very personal. So like, you've been holding on to emotional pain from the past, you know. Then there's shotgunning, which you may have seen before if you've watched a medium do a reading in a public setting or in a group setting. So something like, I'm getting an M. Is it a Mary, a Margaret, maybe a Mark? Like, it can just go all over the place. Like just saying random shit like, I sense that someone in your life has died recently. Or go from there like, I can sense that someone in your family has a health issue that you're concerned about. Like, people are going to fill in the blanks themselves, right? So I saw one example where a medium would say, I sense a recent change. And you go, oh yes, I just switched jobs recently. Like, they didn't fucking know that. And just setting the scene, like in the movie, this woman running the seance has candles, a spooky setup, like where you as the client are immersed in that environment, you are going to be more susceptible to believing that what's going on is the truth. Despite controversies, seances have left a lasting cultural impact. They offered solace to grieving people, empowered marginalized groups, and inspired debates about the boundaries of science and spirituality. The spiritualist movement's fight for inclusivity was significant, encouraging reflection about human potential and the nature of belief. In this modern era, seances have transitioned from theatrical displays to more introspective practices, focusing on spiritual growth and ethical considerations. Whether it's approached with skepticism or reverence, seances continue to resonate with people, reflecting our continuous fascination with the unknown and the eternal quest to bridge the gap between life and death. My relationship with mediumship is complicated. I believe in the paranormal, like I love the weird and the witchy. But when it comes to mediums specifically, I'm a little more skeptical. I used to work for a psychic medium, and honestly, that is a whole other video on its own. But there were so many little moments when I was working there that I was like, wait, what? So like one night I found a fake feather on the ground while I was tidying up, and I was by myself, like I was the only person working, and so I just casually placed it on the office chair. Like, I don't know, I wasn't really thinking about it. And the next morning my boss walks in, apparently declares this as a sign from spirit, and then posted about it all over social media. And then I texted her like, that was literally me that did that. So yeah, for me, it's hard for me to believe that someone who's charging like over $300 per session is actually speaking to your great aunt Phyllis or whomever. A lot of the time I found that these readings are vague, expensive, and not particularly insightful. But that's just me. If it brings you comfort, amazing. But I can't help but notice the echoes of the Victorian era in today's modern spiritualist mediumship practices, which are people in pain searching for meaning and somebody else profiting off of it. I don't know. I mean, I could get more into it with people who have spiritual gifts needing to charge for that exchange of energy. Like, I get that, and that's a conversation for another day, but just for the sake of time. Yeah, that's kind of like how I feel about it. But I don't know, I can't fully dismiss it either, because like, even if a seance is fake, it's still a piece of performance art. And there's something really powerful about people gathering together, lighting candles, and reaching out. and trying to find something more. There is something beautiful about that. So maybe seances were more about the living instead of the dead, the way we process grief, reclaiming our power, or just finding a little meaning in the madness of the world. The seance still lives on, reinvented again and again by whoever's most desperate to believe. And in a way, that's magical in itself. Women found power in it, queer folks found space in it, audiences found wonder in it, and some people absolutely got scammed, which we will talk about in a later video. But that's the duality of everything, right? That strange, seductive space between illusion and faith, where sometimes we just really want to believe that someone is out there whispering to us through the veil. So light a candle, grab a planchette, and ask yourself, do you really want to know what's on the other side?